All right. I think we are going live here with our open faith discussion. And so welcome everybody to the discussion. We have a new the contestant, a new visitor, a new contributor this time around. Jaxon, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself to the rest of us and to our massive crowd.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much for having me on. My name is Jaxon Washburn. I'm a member of the LDS Church from Gilbert, Arizona. Joe and I are in the same ward down here, so that's fun, even though I haven't been able to see him or the ward for a while due to the pandemic. Um, but yeah, I was raised in the church, raised a member, born in Utah, but raised in Arizona. And I come from a mixed faith family. So when I was 12, my mom converted out of Mormonism into non-denominational Christianity. And so during my teenage years, I kind of attended both faith traditions full time. So I have a lot of familiarity with American evangelical Christianity and different flavors of Protestantism. And that kind of upbringing really got me passionate in the study of religion. So I'm about to graduate from ASU, two undergraduate degrees in history and religious studies. And so I'm just very passionate about the subject of religion. It's very interesting to me. And I served a mission in Armenia. So I specifically want to specialize in Armenian religious history as my academic career, but I'm also interested in doing Mormon studies on the side. So yeah.
You're a pro.
What was that?
You're a pro then. This
Oh,
is
oh no, not yet. No.
welcome. That's super exciting. We're
Yeah,
so
thank
glad to.
you.
Joey, I want to invite you to kind of pick up where we left off last week on our cognitive dissonance discussion. What were your final thoughts, and where do you want to keep going?
All right. Yeah, toward the end of last week, was it Jacob that made the Star Wars analogy? I'm wearing my R2D2 shirt today, just for you, Jacob.
Thank you.
He made a Star Wars analogy, and it was about something that got changed from A New Hope to Empire Strikes Back. And I was pointing out that itself was a redaction, and that kind of took us down a line in the last 5 minutes, and we didn't really have time to kind of explore that conversation more. Steve, you brought up the woman caught in adultery, the story of the woman caught in adultery in John chapter 8, which in most modern Bibles is bracketed off to indicate that it was not present in the earliest manuscripts. And so you had asked me, what difference does that make for me? Does that cause any cognitive dissonance for me? Jacob also mentioned Jesus' parables. Does it matter if Jesus' parables were true stories, or is it okay that they're fictional stories? Can they still teach something valuable being fictional stories, right? And then the last point that I made, and then we kind of got cut off, was Paul, the Apostle Paul, says that if the resurrection didn't happen, we are of all people most to be pitied. For me, at least, and being a theologically conservative Christian, my faith is very much tied to real events that had to have happened in time and space, at a location, in a time. And if they didn't really happen, then my faith is completely in vain. And I admitted last week, and I'll admit again this week, there are lots of things about my faith that are utilitarian, like Dave. And I was picking on Dave last week too, about what he had said in two previous videos, two videos ago, about his faith being very pragmatic or utilitarian, right? And I admitted there are some things in my faith that are that way, but there's certain things that aren't. And so I wanted to really open that up to other folks here. Where do you draw that line? What is okay if it's just an allegory, if it's just a fable that has a good moral at the end, and it doesn't really matter if it's a true story or not, and what has to be a true story or it's worthless, right?
Well, I've come off mute, which I think means it's my turn. But first of all, I don't consider anybody challenging or responding to anything that I've ever said, picking on me. So I appreciate the charitable characterization, but I would never feel that way, just so everybody on here knows. Second, it's interesting because we've identified one more spectrum in the many spectra that we've been talking about, whether it's liberal or conservative or metaphorical or literal or orthodox or whatever the opposite of orthodox is, unorthodox, I guess. But I think your question, Joey, is in this spectrum of how true, how historically accurate do the tenets or the stories or the traditions of your faith have to be in order to have value to you? And we've identified with the grandma's, blanket example that certainly there are different types of value, and they divide maybe into the two main categories of physical value and metaphysical value, for lack of better terms here. There's probably better terms out there. And what you're saying is that you feel the need to have really a lot of confidence that things that in your faith tradition are supposed to have happened historically must have happened historically in order to have, and I would say you're heavier on the metaphysical value. And I'm the complete opposite of that spectrum. I don't care if any of it happened. If it's helping me in this life, then that's really all I need. Yes, I hope for the pie in the sky. Yes, I hope that, there's a resurrection with perfect bodies and an afterlife where we're just, living in a state of peace and happiness. Yes, I hope for all that. But if it's not there, I guess I won't be disappointed. But I really see the value of following my faith in this life. And if I didn't see that value, the pie in the sky wouldn't matter to me. So I'm very heavy on the here and now. I'm very heavy on the, or I'm very light on the does it need to have happened. So those are interesting axes that you've drawn. And once again, you and I are almost complete opposites, but I think we get along together really well. So
Joey, I'm interested.
I like
to
you,
know
Dave.
Which of
we are
the
friends.
And you're a great associate to me.
Which
I just said I love you, and you couldn't say it back.
No, that's
I know.
Too early, maybe.
That was his point, I think, Joey.
I got the Star Wars reference.
There you go. We're keeping it in
Joey,
Star Wars. Go ahead, Steve.
Which of are there just a few of these historical events then, like you've mentioned the resurrection? I'm sure you would include the death on the cross and the resurrection. Are there just a few that need to have happened for your faith to not be in vain, or is it all of them? I mean, what is it? Summarize briefly that.
And forgive me if we've covered some of this already, or if we talked about this a little bit in our back channel.
Yeah.
Or maybe we have, yeah. I think I may have mentioned this in the back channel. If not, it's been in the back of my mind. Like the book of Job, right? The story of Job, could that be a fictional account and sort of an allegory, a parable? To go back to Jacob's question, about Jesus' parables. I don't know that there's anything in that story that needs to have happened for the story to be valuable to us. I think, I mean, Paul in Romans and probably other places ties Jesus as the second Adam pretty closely with the first Adam, to the point where, like, doctrinally, theologically, if the atonement is something that really happened, if the resurrection of Christ is something that really happened, it would be really hard for me to scalpel that apart from there having been a real historical Adam figure. I'm not sure if he was really the first human. We can go down that road if we want, I guess. I've thought a lot about it, and I've waffled back and forth on how old is the Earth, right? Different perspectives on creationism and evolution and stuff. But any of the theories that say that the story of Adam and Eve is just allegory, that starts to kind of cause a lot of cognitive dissonance for me. Like, well, if that's allegory, then the rest of it could be allegory, I don't know. I mean, trying to think of other examples of things that just have to have happened or it doesn't make any sense. Maybe the Exodus out of Egypt, but I don't know. I don't know.
Jackson?
I don't know. That's a good question. I asked you guys, where would you draw the line? And I honestly don't know where I would draw the line. But yeah. I don't know if that helped or just muddied the waters even more, but
Yeah,
Just
well,
jump
if I can jump in, I've gotten related questions in the past in dialoguing with Christians or even people of other worldviews with respect to I don't know, questions and controversies around higher criticism, source criticism, things like the documentary hypothesis with respect to the Pentateuch, where like one of the questions that's been difficult for me to answer or kind of wrestle with, right, is did the historical Jesus believe in the documentary hypothesis or in source criticism, or did the historical Jesus accept contemporary academic theories about the literary composition of the Hebrew Bible? And that becomes difficult to answer, I think, at times from certain positions of faith where depending on your Christology, it seems like there would be some pretty serious implications to suggesting that one, either Jesus, the historical Jesus, did you know espouse those theories, which I don't think we can really support from the textual evidence of the New Testament, or secondly, that Jesus did accept, for instance, a historical Moses or the Mosaic authorship of the Pentateuch, and he was wrong about that, right? So it can become very difficult, for myself personally. I don't think I've come to a place where I have like a personally like an answer that I'm confident in with respect to that. I'm still grappling with that because I definitely want to take seriously the implications that might have on my own Christological worldview. But yeah, it becomes really interesting when we think about you just mentioned the Exodus, for instance, Joey, and that's what made me think of it. So yeah, especially where theology is concerned, asking questions of history is one matter. But Christians and Latter-day Saints as well, I would say, definitely come from often religious worldviews that place a lot of stake, a lot of priority on God entering into human history, right? In order to legitimize and grant like spiritual validity or authority to certain institutions or traditions. So it becomes a very big deal if we change our methodology to where historicity is no longer completely required for those metaphysical claims to have like validity.
Well, that's interesting. I mean, you're right. All of the history of religion. I mean, the stories that we get and the history that we believe in came from, we suppose, historical events. But then what matters, or what matters to Dave at least, and to many of us, is just how do those things impact us? And we can't in this discussion here prove whether or not Moses was real, or whether he really wrote the Pentateuch, or whether Joseph Smith actually translated the Book of Abraham as we started this conversation. None of this we're going to be able to prove, but the question here is, how does it actually impact us? I know Dave has something to say. I'm interested too, when we get a second, in Daniel telling us, assume for a second that all of it is historically inaccurate.
Everything, listen, I'm sorry to interrupt, but everything is filtered. Even if it was written by Moses, it's still filtered through Moses. It's inaccurate. And
Sure.
he couldn't write God's accuracy of history in the best of scenarios. So it's really just a line drawing problem. It's not a question of who wrote it. It's about how much inaccuracy are you prepared to stomach in your historical requirements of a textual faith. Go ahead, Stephen. Sorry.
No, I mean, and that's it. If you assume for a second that it's all inaccurate from, the now you made me think of the narrator, the what's
Sure,
the
narrative bias.
well, no, but anyway, the literary device of a
It's
unreliable
narrator.
Unreliable narrator.
Unreliable narrator.
I mean,
That's what I just said.
Not what's that?
I said that's what I just said. Narrative bias. Go ahead.
Yeah. Okay. Anyway, but assuming all of that, is there anything to be gained, for life, where you believe or where you choose to believe the doctrines or the theories or the morality of Scripture and of religion? And that's kind of something I'd like Daniel to chime in on. But Dave, you may have more to say. I know Jake has something. There are many who do. So chime in when you guys.
Yeah, I will try to keep this one brief, and then I'll try to sit out for a while. I'll try. So first of all, Jaxon, great points that you've introduced kind of meta cognitive, dissonance, where now we have to ask questions about whether or not the historical religion in the religion that we follow had themselves cognitive dissonance and what that might mean for us. But I've never met a cognitive dissonance I didn't like talking about. So we're on the right track. Second, yes, I did it. Yes. Second, I was thinking when you were asking the question, and I might not have understood the question because that was a lot of $10 words from Jaxon. Really great stuff. Brings a little legitimacy to the group here.
Professional.
But here's my question is, let's say Jesus had some divine knowledge regarding the fallibility or historical inaccuracy of the scriptural texts that he was working from. Why would he come out and say that? Why would he bother? Why wouldn't he just say, look, you're all in this paradigm. You all accept this as, truth and historically accurate and infallible doctrine. So I'm going to teach you from this. Isn't it the same as saying, to what should I liken the kingdom of heaven?
The Latter-day Saints have a unique perspective of what you just asked because we have records of Jesus actually saying, your scriptures are wrong, correct them. That's
sure. Yeah, he says, didn't I tell you to write this? Right. Anyway, but it's an interesting question of if he would take that view, as I've just supposed, of saying, it's okay, I'm going to teach you from what you have, instead of trying to correct your scriptures and teach you from a correct historical record. If he would do that, then isn't he closer on the scale that we were talking about earlier toward saying, historical accuracy isn't important. It's how you conceptualize the kingdom of God. It's how you conceptualize your role in that kingdom. That's what's important. That's what I'm going to teach you about. And the last thing I was going to say is back to Joey's point on those axes that we were talking about. There certainly seems to be a, what's the word I'm looking for? Well, there's a relationship between how far you go in how much historical accuracy you need and how narrow your choices for a religion become. Joey is compelled to stay within his religious tradition, he feels. I feel great in my religious tradition, but I could probably do what I do faith-wise and religion-wise in most any religious tradition because it's utilitarian. As long as it meets those needs for me. I am not one who puts a lot of stock in the truth claims and the exclusive truth claims of the church that I belong to. I know they're out there. I don't care that much about them. But it's interesting because when talking about this cognitive dissonance, these axes that you've defined, Joey, they're really important because I have the advantage of being so flexible in my faith that it's almost impenetrable. But on the other hand, I have the disadvantage of being completely unmoored. I'm not tied to anything. And so I don't feel I need to defend anything, maybe because I don't feel I have anything to defend. It's an interesting, you kind of choose your poison there. Anyway, okay, I'm out for a while. Go ahead.
I'll go ahead and hop in then. Really great points. Some thoughts that were crossing my mind as this discussion has continued is, number one, the recording of these histories and what exactly the goal of recording records were, because historical accuracy has not always been a goal. And if we're talking about, even if we go as far back as when scholars say that most of the Bible was written, the goal was not historical accuracy, right? They were goals of propaganda, of showing this is why we do what we do, this is why we follow what we do, much less going back as far as the Bible purports to go back, which is before records are even kept in oral traditions. Going back to the point about Jesus, scholarly consensus appears to be that he definitely lived as a first century Jew, right? He did not have this divine knowledge of these documents, right? And the different things that, even if he did have it, he didn't appear to live that way. What's interesting as I look at the Gospels, what I see is Jesus really kind of giving us a lens that we should view Scripture, as he's not viewing Scripture, or at least he doesn't, when he uses it, use it as a way to use it as a litmus test for believers of, hey, you have to believe that this happened, or have, he uses it rather than looking back and saying, these are the traditions that we have to follow. It appears Jesus is using it as, this is a way to springboard me forward towards the kingdom of God and bringing that to pass on the earth.
Yeah, excellent, fantastic thoughts. In fact, I was actually going to say similarly what you're saying, Jake, was about scholars, and that, histocracy, the history was not the end goal for them, and making sure it was historically accurate. And so I was going to say the same thing that you were mentioning. And I think that it's important for us to recognize that within our faith traditions that we are human beings, and human beings are valuable. And as we come together, as we gather records, we gather scriptures, we gather these stories and put them together, there's going to be some inconsistencies that will exist. There's going to be some really interesting contradictions that occur. And it all depends on who is telling the story, who's writing this history. I think about our forefathers of our country in America, and the way that we as Americans view our country. It is different from people outside of our country. I served a mission in a different country. Jackson, you did as well. And what people thought about my leaders, about our country, was very interesting for me to take that on and to kind of filter that through, because I was raised as an American citizen in the United States, and they weren't. And so what they knew about the story, although some things were maybe historically accurate, their view of it or how they told the story is different. I mean, ask a British person about the Revolutionary War, right? It's going to be a different flavor, different way of approaching that. And so we come to religion. We have Catholicism that says that Peter holds the keys, and that there have been popes and people who are descendants from Peter who have been passed those keys, who are in charge. We have the papal seat, right, of this leader. Okay, then we have Protestant, right? People who come and say, well, wait, there are some things that are wrong with this doctrine and what we're teaching here. Let's try to hash this out. Let's try to adjust this and make some changes. They get excommunicated, they get kicked out, they get murdered, they get killed. And it's going back to Jacob's point, right? Because they were not keeping in line with what the propaganda was. They were not trying to adhere to what had already been established. And then you come to Latter-day Saint tradition with Joseph Smith. You have the Second Great Awakening in the United States, right? It's a big thing, a big movement of religion. And Joseph Smith is a part of this. And his worldview and where he comes from is a part of this too. As we take the different accounts of the first vision, some are more Trinitarian in their approach and how they're communicated, right? But in all aspects, as a human being, we take things and we filter them through what is known to us in our own paradigm, in our system. We've got to, I don't know how to articulate this probably correctly, but it's not that we're trying to force things to fit into a certain piece, but in a way, right, we're trying to say, here's the pieces that I have. I want to see what fits best in here. And that's how I approach my faith, is similar to Dave. I don't know that I'd say I'm as utilitarian as Dave, but I am certainly closer to that end. For me, there are things that I receive in my faith that serve me better than other things. I was not raised in the church. I chose to convert later. I'm very familiar with Catholicism. I'm familiar with Protestant churches as well, but I attended non-denominational churches as well. Various creeds that existed and were created, and councils that existed to help kind of gather this Christianity and the early Christian church together. At the end of the day, each of us has to decide what works and what doesn't. For Daniel, he decided, this worked for a point, and culturally will continue to work, but the faith in general didn't work for me, and I had to make those changes. And I think that's something that each of us has to come to is, what purpose does faith and religion serve in our lives? Those actions we talked about, what is important for me? What must be true? What has to be grounded in something for it to be real for me? I think those are all really important things for us to consider as we move forward.
I'll jump in. My burning question is, shouldn't it matter what the intentions of like the founder of a religion were at all? From statements that Joseph Smith has made and others, his associates, people who are involved with like the translation process with Book of Abraham, Book of Mormon, like it's pretty clear. It would be hard to argue that they didn't view it as that they were literally translating these things. Joseph Smith would walk around and say, oh, these bones, these were Zelphs, a Lamanite chieftain that died here. He made these kinds of statements that make it pretty clear that he saw it as a literal historical thing that happened. So when I was going through, like before my faith crisis, like just when I was kind of in my more nuanced stage, I was trying to rationalize a lot of these problems. And I came to the realization that I had kind of created a religion of one, a religion that just was, my view of everything. And I realized I didn't have any reason to think that it was more right than anybody else's, other than just I wanted it to be. My religion, my version of Mormonism was at odds with probably most, if not all, of the current leadership of the church, all the apostles, first presidency. Many of them have made statements to the effect that this has to be literal in some sense. Maybe that's not the view of all of them, but, and I don't have any quotes right in front of me, but they've made statements about, well, this has to be true, or Joseph Smith was a fraud. There's no way around it. And I tend to agree with that all or nothing proposition.
Joey?
I want to say like 50 different things. So where to even start? Because I really liked what Daniel just said. And I mean, in Protestantism, this is the kind of stuff that causes church splits, denomination splits, right? Denomination starts to get a little too liberal, and all the conservatives in the denomination are just like, oh, we're out. And they go form their own conservative denomination, right? And we have that advantage in Protestantism because there isn't a pope, right? Nobody's got a monopoly on the one true church, right? In Catholicism, which is a big tent, right? You've got lots of different people all over the spectrum and different schools of thought, within Catholicism. And that's happening in Mormonism today. It seems like, and I think Mormonism is a big enough tent for everyone to have a home in there, right? But you don't have the luxury of just, oh, well, I don't like what's going on, I'm going to go start my own. Well, a few people do, right? You got guys like, who was the guy that just started his own thing? Yeah, Denver Snuffer. You've got guys like that, and there have been many guys like that have kind of gone their own way out of Mormonism.
There's so much they lose if they leave, right? They lose temple availability, and they lose,
right.
Yeah, they have to set up their own.
You've got to stay in, and you've got to carve out a niche for like, well, this is my version of Mormonism, and this is someone else's version of Mormonism. But you have to stay in because if you walk away, there's so much you lose. And same with Catholicism, but it's not true of Presbyterianism. I left the Mormon church, or the LDS church, 20 years ago. 8 years ago, I left the Baptist church, but I was going from being Baptist to being Presbyterian. And it was not nearly the kind of, tectonic plate shift, that happened 20 years ago, because I'm still a Trinitarian. I still believe in the inerrancy of the Bible. I still believe in salvation by faith alone. in Christ alone. I believe all the five solas. I'm in another Protestant church, the biggest thing that changed is some of my thoughts about, what baptism means and who should be baptized. And that's a discussion for another day. But what I was going to say when I first unmuted myself. And so anyway, Daniel, I think you're absolutely right. Doesn't it matter what Joseph Smith thought about it? And if we're all followers of Joseph Smith, then shouldn't we hold the same exact view as Joseph Smith? And I think it just gets complicated by the fact that he called it the only true church. And so if you disagree with him a little bit, well, you can't just walk away because it's the only true church. And so you carve out a niche for yourself inside of the only true church, even though your views are different. That would create a lot of cognitive dissonance for me. I don't know how you guys do it. But I admit that that's my advantage. You just do it. Yeah. If there's no Pope, then, I'm kind of, I can do whatever I want. So when I switched from being Baptist to Presbyterian, there was no cognitive dissonance there. It wasn't like, do I stay in the Baptist church because it's the true church, even though I don't disagree with some of these? No, it was just like, whatever, I'll just go be a Presbyterian. We made a decision like that we were going to leave the church, and we went shopping for a new church that like fit what we believed, and that's an advantage that I have. And so I don't mean to like, brag about that, I guess. I don't know, but
I don't think you're bragging.
Yeah, anyway. But
this guy's always bragging about how easy it was to leave his church. Just brags.
Yeah. What I was going to say earlier when I first unmuted myself, though, was
sometimes
just like
the Latter-day
everything's
Saints
connected, right?
They could push wards. We can relate in that much, I wish I could just jump to the neighboring.
I wish I could just switch wards. Yeah. And that's the switch from Baptist to Presbyterian was a lot like that. It was just like I switched wards. It didn't feel like a huge shift. But I was going to say, like, everything's connected. I was saying earlier, like, if the story of Jesus is true, what other stories have to be true? And I like, Jackson, you pointed out, like, well, Jesus said some stuff about Moses, and he said some stuff about Adam. And if he was really God, walking around on earth in the flesh, then he should have known the right answers to some of those things that he was talking about. And so that sort of forces us to have certain views of even older texts, or else it creates cognitive dissonance, right? The other thing I was going to point out, that everything's connected. I think part of what might be informing a lot of the way you guys are thinking is our views on. Now I'm going to open up a whole new can of worms. Our views on free will, right? Right, Dave. Two of you.
Well, you had no choice. You had no choice but to bring this up, Joey. So I don't blame you.
Yeah. Oh, I know. We're gonna.
Our reactions was scripted in fate.
It is your
yeah, God made you do it. Yeah. Both Dave and Joe talked about how these are human authors that are putting down a text, and they're fallible, right? And I don't disagree with that. They were human and they were fallible, but there's a doctrine, and I'm going to use a $10 word. Here you go, Dave. Verbal plenary inspiration.
That's a $30 word.
The doctrine of verbal plenary inspiration, and I believe it's taught in the Bible, is that even though they were human authors and they were writing what they wanted to write, that ultimately behind them, God was directing all things so that what would end up being written down would be his words. And so, yeah, I disagree with both Dave and Joe when they said that, like, what we have here is just the words of humans. I think it is God's word. And what Dave said, like, it's filtered through Moses, like it's filtered through a human. Yes, they were Moses's words, but they were also God's words. God made sure that what Moses wrote down was his words.
Well, that brings the topic to revelation, personal revelation. When is it me speaking or thinking something, and when is it God? And I don't know necessarily we'll get into it, but
when is the Pope speaking ex cathedra versus when is the Pope infallible and when is he not?
We don't have to go to Catholicism for that example. You got a whole bunch of Mormons.
That's how No, I know, but that, I don't know. Maybe that's me wanting to express it in terms that don't have anything to do with Mormonism, because I find that, and I think Daniel, I think, made a comment about this too. Like, after you leave the church, and this is the famous, why do people leave the church and then they can't leave it alone? And I think I went through that phase where I couldn't leave it alone, but I hope that I'm now at a point where I can leave it alone. And so I try to express things not just in terms of the way that a Mormon would understand, but in the way that all or most Christians would understand, right? And I think most Christians would say it like that, the example of when is the Pope speaking infallibly and when is he not. Anyway.
Jake, what are your thoughts there?
Yeah, I want to go back to something that Daniel mentioned, because I think it gets to the heart of the matter. He said that he was coming to his own conclusions on all these things, and he realized that it didn't really match up, and he created a religion of one. My experience is looking around as everyone actually is a member of a religion of one. I can bet that you go to any two different people and ask their beliefs, and somewhere along the spectrum, they're going to believe differently than the person that's next to them, no matter what the creeds say that they belong to, no matter what. And so you're going to find it all throughout, and you find it all throughout the scriptures, different views on, does God have a body? Is it corporeal, or does he not? Whether it's the Bible, the Book of Mormon. And so on that note, looping it back to Mormonism, Latter-day Saints, something as interesting that I think we've kind of lost our way on is how against creeds and against litmus tests of being a member of a church Joseph Smith was. He didn't like creeds. He didn't like being bound down to things. In fact, we have numerous instances where he's saying, I don't judge anyone for erring in doctrine. And so I think that's my personal belief, right, on my spiritual journey is God doesn't care so much what we believe, as long as what we believe is inspiring us to serve one another, to be better. Now, of course, this will take us down the rabbit hole again. Okay, well, but Jesus, right, salvation, atonement, resurrection, what has to necessarily be true? How much is being a good person? How far will that get you? In my view, that's why we talk about the atonement being an infinite atonement.
Jaxon, you want to jump in?
Yeah, I appreciated some of the comments from Joey with respect to some of the culture within Mormonism and the difficulty that can take place when you are a member of the institutional LDS Church, but you may or may not agree with everything that's going on, and at times there's almost this personal questioning that has to take place where you decide, am I going to continue to be part of this community, or how can I work this out? Or like some have done, whether into the direction of, leaving the faith for other religious traditions, no religious tradition, or a new form of Mormon restorationism. When does that breaking point happen? And so I get personal questions about this a lot, because I'm fairly vocal with my religious views on social media, and I enjoy talking about religion, and sometimes that brings me into points of disagreement either with my fellow saints, or maybe there's areas in which I take a different position than the institutional church might, LDS church might. And so, I'll have people ask me like, well, like, what are you doing, Jaxon? You're just participating in cafeteria Mormonism. And is it valid for you to really just like pick and choose like this? Because from the outside, it looks like you're just creating God, creating religion in your own image to suit your own preferences. And so I appreciated what Jacob just said, because I would agree with him that frankly, I think all of us, no matter what our worldview is, consciously or not, participates in this, that we construct our worldviews, that they are influenced by our lived experiences. And so like personally, through my study of Mormon history, whether with respect to voices in scripture or various leaders across church history, some of them even contemporaries of each other, I see various forms of disagreement across the tradition. And so for me, like a lot of times, those who might disagree with the concept of cafeteria Mormonism, I don't really like the term, but I'll just use that as shorthand. They're coming from a place of wanting to establish a set series of beliefs that and practices or views that they declare to be orthodox. And at least like my upbringing was characterized by a Mormonism that was very much defined by leaders like Bruce R. McConkie and others in the 20th century that had particular theological views as part of their Mormonism. I think one of the first pieces I ever interacted with
Jackson, maybe flesh out real quick what those types of views were, a McConkie type of view.
Yeah, so an example, one of the first pieces that I ever interacted with as I started engaging Mormonism on social media and in a theological kind of way was Bruce R. McConkie's 1980 talk at BYU called The Seven Deadly Heresies, where he lists out 7 things which Latter-day Saints should not believe. And they range from belief in evolution to progression between kingdoms to different things like that. And so I offered like a blog post, like commenting on my areas of agreement and disagreement with Elder McConkie, and offered my own kind of like, I guess like heresies or areas that I see as problem areas for contemporary Latter-day Saints. But in looking into some of those things that he was declaring heresies through my study of Mormon history, like for instance, with respect to progression between kingdoms, there are various Mormon leaders who historically have expressed an openness or a belief in in progression between kingdoms, right? So, we come to a point where even in Joseph Smith's life, the Mormonism of Orson Pratt might look different than the Mormonism of Joseph Smith, which might look different than the Mormonism of Brigham Young. And so for me, I'm not inherently uncomfortable with the idea of picking and choosing. And I don't do it in a flippant sense, or at least I try not to, in order to make things easier on myself or cater to my own sensibilities. But I just try to be honest about the ways in which I approach religion, and that I believe like all of us essentially approach our religious or non-religious worldviews in making choices about what stays, what goes, and where we settle.
In the Latter-day Saint faith, I mean, is there really a defined creed or litmus test for the faith, other than I've been sitting here thinking about it, and I think the only one I can come up with is the current set of temple recommend questions, and is that a valid litmus test of the faith? Certainly didn't start with Joseph Smith.
Yeah, and in terms of a creed, closest thing I could point to is probably the Articles of Faith or something like that. But even then, the temple recommend questions have been somewhat fluid over time, and it's really interesting that really only 3 of them have to do with matters of belief. The rest have to do with matters of practice, and even then, all of them are more or less yes or no. So I would say, from that perspective, there's certainly an emphasis more on orthopraxy than orthodoxy within institutional Mormonism, even if,
and I think there's that wide
currents might push the other way. Yeah.
There's that you can be from several different from a range of orthodoxy or practice and be able to answer the temple recommend questions in the affirmative. But it would indicate, though, that if you're listening to those temple recommend questions and you find yourself unable to answer them, you're like, I can't reconcile. There's no way that I can make myself believe and say yes to these questions. Then you're like, okay, maybe it's time for me to step out. Joey, you have something to.
Well, yeah, that in what you already said is kind of what I was going to get at. Like, so in Protestantism, I think it's a Protestant thing. It might be a Catholic thing. I've tried to trace this quote, and I think it's like a 16th or 17th century. There's a famous saying, and a lot of people say that Augustine said it, but it's way more modern than that. The saying is, in essentials unity, in non-essentials liberty, and in all things charity or love. And the idea is basically, look, there's a few things, and I can probably count them on one hand, that are like, you have to believe those things or you're not a Christian, right? And everything else is a non-essential, and I'm going to extend liberty to you to believe those things, and I've got my own opinion. So you talk about cafeteria Mormonism, right? And I think you're absolutely right, Jacob. There's probably no one on this planet that has the exact same set of beliefs than any other person on the planet. You ask 10 people what the atonement means, and you'll get 11 different answers, right? But there ought to be a core set of essential doctrines that you do hold in common, or at least as close to in common as you can, as finite, fallible humans. And so, like Steve just asked the question, what is it? And maybe it's not even orthodoxy. Maybe it is about orthopraxy in the LDS faith. And if it is, then we're in totally different paradigms, totally different worlds, I guess. Because I want to write down, here's the 5 different things, and if I wrote it down, it would basically be like a creed, right? And maybe the easiest shorthand for me would just, go read the Nicene Creed. That's it, but I could probably write them down myself, right? Like, so what, with the 5 of you here that are, 5, there's 5 of you, right, that are LDS, and we've identified lots of things that you have in common and don't have in common, but what is it that makes the 5 of you all LDS? What is the core set of whatever? I think we've maybe beat a dead horse, but we've already kind of said, your views on the translation method for the Book of Abraham probably doesn't make that list, right? You can have a range of views on that, and the tent is big enough that you still are in the tent. So what, if anything, is there a thing that if you believed it would make you not LDS? Can you
polygamy.
deny? Okay.
Good one.
Can you deny the existence of God and still be a Latter-day Saint?
I mean,
and what would
be a
that
Latter-day Saint
mean?
or go to the temple.
Yeah.
You know
Okay,
the answers
is that-
to these
is that-
questions.
And there's a good point.
Is that
We've
one
got-
of the questions? What are the questions?
Yes, the first question, as I recall it, is basically the first article of faith. Do you believe in
Okay.
God, the eternal Father, and His Son, Jesus Christ, and in the Holy Ghost?
Okay.
So, and
So,
I
yes,
guess
there are certainly core beliefs. I mean, we all
Yeah.
know that there are fundamental, there has to be a definition.
Yeah.
If you don't have a definition of your religion, you don't have a religion. And this is
If you
kind
don't-
of what I was talking about earlier, is if in my religion of one, I really don't have that much of a definition. Am I even a Mormon? Am I even anything? Am I just following what is helping me and feels good? Maybe. And I'm pretty comfortable with that. I don't want to start talking about who does and doesn't have a temple recommend, but let's just say I can get through the doctrinal questions on the temple recommend interview with a clear conscience.
Well, and with those temple recommend questions, I don't think any of them are about historical specific moments. Do you believe this was a historically accurate event?
No, sure, but they do ask. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I was just going to say that, if you believe in the restoration of the gospel and the prophet Joseph Smith, and I'm not quoting it word for word, but certainly if you don't have a way to reconcile in your faith that Joseph Smith is the prophet of the restoration, it doesn't make a lot of sense for you to claim to be a Latter-day Saint.
Yes.
And then
I think that there are some things.
Continuing onward, yeah, if you can't reconcile in some way that leadership and that mantle of priesthood responsibility or whatever, the keys of the priesthood have passed on to today's first presidency in the Quorum of the 12, then once again, it doesn't make a lot of sense to be in the mainstream Latter-day Saint faith. So those 3 things I think are key, but none of them are. You don't have to say, and I absolutely believe that the Melchizedek priesthood was restored on the banks of the, which river?
Susquehanna.
Sounds like you guys are saying I can't get a temple recommend. That's what I'm getting from this.
You are saying
that was our whole point of this. That was the point of this whole series. Now that you've arrived there, Daniel, we're done.
You're out,
Hey.
and we're in.
Well, and Daniel, I think you said in one of the previous videos, you're still a member. I've
Yeah,
I've resigned my membership, so I definitely can't get one. Even if I answered all the questions, yes, I'd have to do a bunch of other stuff before I could get one.
Well, on a more serious note, like I could see a way that I could nuance the answer. I don't have any interest in doing this, but I could see somebody going in and saying, I believe in God, like as an atheist, but it's like this metaphorical kind of conceptual thing. And Jesus Christ, like I believe that he was probably a real person, a wise teacher, you know, and I believe Joseph Smith was a prophet in the sense that he had all these like interesting ideas, or, you know, it's kind of a stretch, but I could see somebody doing that. There probably have been really, really nuanced members who are pretty much atheists who have done it to be able to witness a child's
And the interesting
marriage
thing
or
is,
something.
I think most of us as Latter-day Saints, not most, okay, backing up, but some as Latter-day Saints, if we were aware of such a person, we would be comfortable accepting them if they had decided that they could. There are definitely some Latter-day Saints, though, who would say, what are you doing here? You know, you can't do that. You can't rationalize it that way. But I think others would say, sure, he
In
can.
sheep's
Whatever.
clothing.
Well, the only thing you're not allowed to do is
Drink coffee.
share these views. Yeah,
I'm just kidding.
you can hold them, but you can't preach them. And there's certainly there's a level where you get to, oh my goodness, you're preaching false doctrine. The bishop gets involved, you lose your temple recommend, whatever. But there's a big gray zone where you're simply sharing your own views where people get uncomfortable. Yes. Raise your hand if you've been somebody who has shared something in a Latter-day Saint church meeting that you know wasn't received well by the kind of broader orthodoxy. Yes, I mean, story of my life. But I assume everybody on this group has probably done that at some point. And yet, you know,
you weren't then called into the bishop's office and asked to recant, and yeah, so.
Well, something I was thinking earlier is if on these axes of how flexible can your faith be, how many round pegs can you fit into square holes, or vice versa, and how married to historicity are you, etc. All the things we've talked about. Basically, you know, what I'm starting to see take shape, and it's not surprising, but it's one of those things where it's like, oh yeah, I've walked around the whole world. I ended up in my backyard, and here's what I wanted. You know, this is what I'm getting to in our discussion, is that the less rigid, the less rigid you are in your faith, the less cognitive dissonance you experience. That we already knew. We talked about that in our first episode. But there's also this kind of byproduct, which is also the less defined your religious faith is. And certainly you can take that to the logical extreme where you say, all right, fine. Again, and I'm making my same point over again because it's just so it's resonating with me today. Maybe you get to the point where you don't feel you have to defend anything. That's where I feel I am, but it may be because you feel like you don't have anything to defend. Is that a loss or a win? That's what I don't know. Do you have to have something that's defined, that's exclusive, to be able to say, all right, the only way I can define my faith is by cutting off certain other things, by coming up with articles of faith and a list of temple recommend questions. That's how I know I'm a Mormon. Well, if you don't feel boxed in by that, are you a Mormon? And I guess the flip side of this question is, if ultimately, given enough time, the only people that stay in the church are the ones who didn't limit and define their beliefs and build walls around them, then does that mean that the church itself and its tenets are untenable, to use the same? Do you know what I mean? Like, if ultimately the only people that stay are the ones who have built their cafeteria religion of one, which is different than the tenets. Now, I'm not saying that's the case, because I think there are more of the membership that is Orthodox than unorthodox, it seems to me. I said I would be quiet and I lied.
Does anybody have any final words for this round? We'll come back next week, but I appreciate all of you joining me. And And I guess we'll say Happy New Year to all of you. And we'll see you a week from today.
See you next year.
Happy New Year.
Good to meet you,
See guys.
Jackson. Thanks for joining in.
Very much.